You're listening to Go Podcast Yourself Network.
Let's go check it out
at gopodcastyourself.com. And we love you.
Consciousness is a dream that I pursue.
He fumbles at your spirit as players at the keys. Before they drop full music on, he stuns you by degrees.
Consciousness is a dream that I pursue. Come, sealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day. Light thickens and the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. Good things of day begin to droop and drowse, whilst night's black agents to their praise do rouse. Thou marvelst at my words, but hold thee still.
This is Twilight on the Western Door. Sator, Aripo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. Consciousness is a dream that I
pursue. Hi everyone, this is Mason Winfield, the host of Twilight on the Western Door, our program of discussions and interviews with cutting-edge scholars into the roots of the spiritual, the supernatural, and the paranormal. Today we're taking a little walk into a twilight, this time into the subject of UFOs and the connection to that mysterious critter we call the Bigfoot. I'm going to begin today, though, with a joke that some may find a little off color, but I really think it's going to lead into something about the paranormal. Many of you may have heard this joke, and it's got an F-bomb at the end, and if you can't handle that, please plug your ears. But there's a tourist who comes into a pub in Scotland, and he finds a guy drinking alone during the day at the pub. And this old Scotsman keeps pounding it down. The two fall into conversation. The guy reminisces. "You see that stone pier out there," he says. "I built that by hand out of stones I hauled up from the bottom of the bay. But do they call me McCulloch, the pier builder? When the storm of 1982 hit, I warned the local school and saved 100 children," he says. "Do they call me McCulloch, the hero? I started a business that employed 100 people. Do they call me McCulloch, the manufacturer?" Takes a long meditative swig. "But you fuck one sheep, and ever after." That was hysterical. If I had to start making illicit national jokes about sheep, I don't think I'd start with Scotland. But the subject of the paranormal has many contradictions, and one of them is related to that old joke. You can study the Holocaust, and people don't call you a Nazi. The guy can become a gynecologist, and they don't call him a perv. But you study the paranormal, and a lot of times people start out with the impression that you're a kook. I get it all the time. I start to interview people, and they go, "My, you're remarkably stable and sane." Well, duh. You know, the guy we're about to talk to soon is distinguished among the study of the UFO phenomena anywhere in the paranormal for being highly logical and sensible. And we are honored to have, as the 9th guest of Twilight on the Western Door, one of the more systematic people who's decided to study this subject, the researcher, lecturer, and author, Stan Gordon. This is exactly the sort of speaker we like on Twilight, somebody who can really teach us something. Stan, thanks for joining us on a little step into the twilight, into the realm of that knowledge that exists between the daylight and the darkness. Mr. Gordon, are you ready for that little walk into the shadow?
Yes, we are, and thank you very much for having me on your program.
It's a big honor, all ours. I'd like to begin with our 10-question challenge, where I think we've got way more material than we'll be able to get in today, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where were you brought up? Where did you live? And how did you get going in this field?
Well, this will take a few minutes, but
Shoot.
Actually this year will be 56 years of research in the field, and I'm still very, very active. I started back in 1959 when I was 10 years old, and how I got involved is my birthday happens to be during the Halloween season. And on my 10th birthday, my parents gave me an AM radio as a birthday gift, and I was listening to the AM radio, and because of Halloween, there were some radio shows talking about unusual happenings. They were talking about strange creatures and haunted houses and flying saucers, and I was very curious as a 10-year-old, and I wanted to know if these people were making these stories up or not. So I began to read all the books I could find on the subject, began to cut articles out of the newspapers by some on unusual subjects, and made scrapbooks. And if something appeared in my local paper that somebody claimed was seeing a UFO, I called them on the telephone and asked them questions about it and kept records of it. And I was 16 back in 1965 when the UFO crash incident happened near Kecksburg, PA, and I started investigating that sighting from the time it happened. I've been working on that now. This year will be 50 years for the anniversary. And that was how it began. But then things got even deeper. In late 1960s, I got involved with a group called the UFO Research Institute of Pittsburgh. It was a small group of mainly scientists and engineers from Westinghouse. One of the names you recognize was Stanton Friedman. That was when he was just beginning. And I was the youngster of the group, and I got involved with them. And I ended up becoming their telephone sighting coordinator because I already had a lot of experience out in the field doing investigations and interviews. So when they would get a report, it would come to my home. I would do the initial interviews and determine if the case warranted further investigation. And I stayed with their group till they shut it down. In 1969, I decided to set up my own hotline for the public, and I began to make contact with the local police and the media to tell them about my interest in these subjects. And, of course, back in those days, there was a lot of ridicule, but I handled it very carefully and very seriously. And within weeks of people finding out about my number, the telephone in my home was ringing off the hook day and night. People were calling about all kind of strange subjects, from UFOs to Bigfoot to haunted houses, you name it, the calls were coming in. And I realized that this was more than I can handle on my own, so I decided at the time to set up a research group, a volunteer group, hopefully of research people. And then in 1970, they founded the first of three groups that started out small around the Pittsburgh area. Then in 1973, expanded to cover into the whole state of Pennsylvania. And I had those groups running for many, many years. And it was quite unique in that the majority of people involved in the group were specialists. We had scientists and engineers, all kind of technicians, former military intelligence people, police officers, people who were trained to go out to investigate and interview witnesses. And that's what we did, and we worked on hundreds of thousands of cases. So my hotline's been open since 1969. It is still very, very active with calls. Reports come in here almost every day with current or past reports. And, of course, I get a lot of email reports now through my website as well. So I've been doing this now, as I said, for 56 years. And in all the years I've been doing this, I have never personally seen a UFO or a Bigfoot.
Isn't that interesting? Wow. And I mean that seriously, because a lot of people who are into this type of study, I mean, it goes right back to my joke. You know, if you do one thing, you get stereotyped, and people think you buy into it. I meet people, and I'm ask them if they've heard any supernatural folklore, and they've asked me, and they may look at me funny and go, "You believe in all that?" And I tell them, I'm not an experiencer. I don't talk to the dead, And most people who go into this are experiencers, but yet you've simply chosen it as a subject of study. That's pretty cool. Now, folklorists have been noticing for centuries that certain small areas pile up paranormal reports of all kinds. It seems like there's small places in the world where people just say they see things, and they don't always see the same thing. It's not like you always get ghosts, or you always get Bigfoot, or you always get the Loch Ness Monster. You tend to get a grab bag of supernatural folklore. Do you have any accounting for the fact that Bigfoot sightings are associated with so many UFO sightings? Do you have a theory?
Well, yeah, and it's very deep, and there's a lot to talk about here. And you were mentioning about certain kind of more localized areas of activity. I think you were bringing up, if I understood it. And while reports come in from all across Pennsylvania all year round of UFO sightings, and there's scattered Bigfoot reports across the state. We do get a lot more reports here in southwestern Pennsylvania, It may be also because we have a lot more contacts as part of the state, but sightings come in from everywhere. But historically, we have noticed certain locales where it's even higher than normal. And one of those areas, historically, is along the Chestnut Ridge. The Chestnut Ridge is a mountain range that runs from Preston County, West Virginia, to Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County in southwest PA. It's about 100 miles long. We don't know why, but historically, and this goes back many, many years, there's been a lot of history all along the ridge and areas that boundary along the ridge, that where there are UFO sightings, Bigfoot sightings, encounters with other strange creatures such as Black Panther sightings, gigantic birds, or some strange flying creatures, for a better term, we call them Thunderbird sightings, all kind of other anomalous type phenomena goes along the ridge, unexplained booms, things that fall from the sky, weird lights, just all kind of strange stuff goes on all along the ridge year after year. And certain areas, like along one part of the ridge outside of Latrobe, PA, over towards Derry Township, we don't know why, but it has a very active history of Bigfoot sightings. And they keep going on almost year after year. So do other cryptids in that area. And many of these have been extremely close range, some even in daylight. When I say close range, I'm talking people have been within 5 to 10 feet and easily within 50 feet of many of these incidents over the years. And so that's very, very interesting. But going back to what you asked about UFOs and Bigfoot, it's going to take me a little bit to explain this to you because it's very detailed. But we first really noticed this back during this massive wave of UFO and Bigfoot sightings that occurred here in 1973 and then 1974. And do you want me at this point to go into some of this detail, or do you want to go with some further questions?
Now, the Chestnut Ridge looks to me, if my memory is correct, the Chestnut Ridge looks like it runs straight north-south down from the Niagara River. Am I correct? You drop straight down? No? Oh, good.
No, this is a ridge that goes from Preston County, West Virginia, up through southwest Pennsylvania. It's a part of the Allegheny Mountain System. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad to get that cleared up before I stated it publicly.
I don't know how much detail we really need on individual cases, but do you have an estimate for the percentage of Bigfoot sighting or Bigfoot reports that are associated with UFO reports? I mean, if there's even one, to me it seems miraculous, but it sounds like there may be many.
Well, there may be a lot more than we understand, because one thing I found out when this outbreak occurred in 73, and we documented some of the most unusual, very detailed incidents where, in some cases, UFOs and Bigfoot were seen together at the same time and place. But I can tell you, since that time period, and some of these cases go on at times over the years, but they're very rare. What I'm saying is, most UFO sightings have no connection with Bigfoot, and most Bigfoot sightings have no connection with UFOs. But there's that percentage of those reports, and it's really hard to say exactly what it is, because many years ago, going back in the 70s, when I was uncovering this material, I began to have contact with researchers throughout the country and around the world. And I've been in contact with many of these people for many years since that time. And what I find out is that many similar type of events have been occurring throughout our country and other parts of the world for years and years. But many people, both in the UFO and Bigfoot field, who have come across these cases, researchers, are reluctant to talk about it because they're afraid of being ridiculed. Or it goes against their belief structure, so they don't want to deal with those type of reports. And I know even in recent years, there's no doubt about it. There's many people in the Bigfoot field who just completely ignore any sightings where a witness talks about seeing strange lights or strange objects in the area where they had a Bigfoot sighting. Yeah. So there may well be a lot more data out there that we just don't know about.
Sure. No, I get that, and I'm motivated to comment that it's so interesting that what you do, I'm inferring, is that you'll go back and back interview witnesses to earlier reports. And you can learn so much doing that, because very often the reports we read, we get in the papers, whatever, they're they're not only very cursory, but the interview is being conducted by somebody that doesn't have any familiarity with the subject. They don't know what to look for. But if you had to venture a percentage, and I'll accept that this is just winging it, but if I were to say what percent of Bigfoot sightings overlap with UFO reports or whatever, would you say 5% or?
It would be small, okay, but like I said, there's probably a lot more. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, I gave a lecture at a big. It was the McMinnville, Oregon UFO festival out there, and we had a very good response. And I gave a lecture on this topic of UFO and Bigfoot sightings, and that was Bigfoot country out there. It's very famous for Bigfoot sightings, and there were a lot of well-known Bigfoot researchers from the area who were at my lecture. And I felt, gee, probably when I give this, there's probably going to be some negativity to what I'm saying. And in fact, it was completely opposite, which is what I've been finding in more recent years, especially since I read my Silent Invasion book, all about these type of things. And afterwards, some of these researchers came up to me, or later they contacted me by phone or email personally, and they said, we are so glad that you brought this subject up, because we've been dealing with the same strange reports out here, cases where footprints have suddenly stop and disappear, people shooting at the creatures and they disappear, but everybody's afraid to talk about it. So it's something that's going on in many, many different areas. And once again, there may be a lot more of this data that's out there we just don't know about. But, I would say percentage of cases that are published or we know about is a very small percentage compared to the general UFO and Bigfoot reports that you get.
Sure. I think I can get why some people would be hesitant to make that connection publicly, because if you're sort of an advocate for the need of taking a subject seriously, like taking the UFO material seriously, and you get an eyewitness who just is out of discipline, seems to report a Bigfoot at the same time, why you would naturally be afraid that the general public would think you're all kooks,
What I have to deal with is the fact that I deal with many types of people from all walks of life who have had these experiences, from young children to adults, from police officers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, all kind of reputable people. And the thing is, my best witnesses are people who would never believe that these type of experiences could happen until they had their own personal account.
Mine too.
And many of these people have life-changing experiences. Many of these people I've interviewed over the years or called the police, and then they forwarded calls for me to follow up on. These were people who had no interest in these subjects, didn't believe in these things. It was, like I said, a life-changing event for many of these people. And as you said, some of these people I've been in touch with still from 20, 30 years ago. And it's amazing some of the interesting things that have happened to them and their family since. And in some cases, these people's lives have never been right since that day. I mean, some of these people still can't deal with the fact that they encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist.
At your lecture at Niagara County Community College, I think that was about 2 years ago.
I think it was a little longer than that, but it's been a while. Time goes quick.
Yeah, I guess. But I remember meeting you and your buddies, Phil Hasley and some of the hosts at that wonderful restaurant there, and you were so welcoming to me. And I remember being very impressed with your talk. But do you remember at your talk in Sanborn, New York, that there was a guy there? He looked like a tough guy, and he was in his mid-50s. And this guy was in the audience, and he had handled the skull of some kind of a creature, and he was a hunter, and it was the Bigfoot incident involved with Lewiston, New York. And this guy came to me. Maybe he never talked to you, but he was there just to hear you, and he was haunted by holding the skull of this creature. He said, "I've seen bears, I've shot bears, I've skinned bears. The skull I held was no bear." I mean, this guy was haunted. And you're making plenty of sense there when you say that people come to see us, and sometimes they hide in the back and they don't even come talk to us. They just, I don't know, why do they come if they aren't going to ask us questions? Hey, I'm going to take a jump ahead. I'm skipping ahead in my questions here because we seem to be nearing this subject. You talk about people having exceptional experiences and they're haunted by them. Have you noticed a general connection to psychic phenomena like extrasensory experiences among people who are UFO / or Bigfoot experiencers?
Oh, yeah. And I noticed this years and years ago when I started looking to the backgrounds of witnesses. And, unfortunately, I've been doing this pretty much out of my pocket for all my life. And I was running two very large, probably the most active groups in the country back in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. So it was like running these two organizations, supporting them and had a full-time job and a family. And, so I work as an independent researcher now. So unfortunately, we didn't have the funding to do some of the studies I wish I had time to do back in those days. And we had ongoing reports coming in constantly. But I began to find that looking back into the background of certain individuals, I began to find that a lot of these people, from the time they were very young, began to have experiences with various types of paranormal events, poltergeist, invisible playmates as very young. Later they experienced different, some lived in haunted houses, some had other type of paranormal activity. Many of them talked to me about having a lifetime of ESP experiences, premonitions, knowing the phone was going to ring before it did, just all kind of things like this. And many of those people later in their lives would have UFO sightings or encounters with strange creatures. And in fact, studying some of these families for years and years now, I found that just like with some of the abduction cases, you had generations of families having these events going on, parents, grandparents, grandchildren, and I still am in contact with some of these people today. And I also found some interesting things. For example, I'd had some case over the years where I'd have a group of people, and only certain people within that group were seeing an object hovering nearby, for example, where the other people couldn't see it. So I've wondered for years and years, do certain people who have certain abilities that they're able to perceive beyond the normal audio-visual ranges of other people, are they more susceptible to having these experiences? Is the phenomena attracted to them? And, I think we're dealing with, I've said years and years ago, the phenomena we're dealing with is so strange it protects itself.
Interesting. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who's, Freud was his tutor and his big rival, and Jung is very poetic among psychoanalysts, and he's still revered to this day, but Jung actually wrote a book on the UFO phenomena, and he said at one point in his book, this phenomenon is so powerful in the mind of the general public that I can't believe a responsible psychoanalyst or psychologist wouldn't be interested in it. It's got impact just because it's so widespread.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's why, the people I was dealing with back in the early days of my early groups, I mean, we had psychologists, psychiatrists, medical people, all volunteer their time, to deal with some of the cases we dealt with, and we got into some extremely amazing cases. And like I said, I've worked on thousands and thousands of cases now since I've been out in the field since 1965. And, what we've come up with, a lot of it is just so strange, and I don't have the answers as to what's going on, but it's made myself and some of my colleagues very well convinced that there's much more to both UFO and Bigfoot, and probably into the cryptid mystery than anybody has any idea of.
Yes, I've thought that for a while myself. I think expecting them, just for me. Well, why don't I ask you, do you think Bigfoot is a physical, material, biological creature?
Well, and this is, I can answer that question to a degree, because when I started in this back in the early days, I always felt from the many reports of Bigfoot in Pennsylvania, I mean, there have been records going back with the Native Americans and newspapers in the 1800s talk about accounts in Pennsylvania. I've interviewed hundreds of people in Pennsylvania who claim to have seen Bigfoot over the years, and many of these were extremely close-range cases. And I was always convinced that Bigfoot was some type of unknown primate. Until those events began to break out during the 70s, and cases since then, And one case, which was incredible, and to really go into detail, it takes several minutes, but just very briefly, as this wave of reports from 73 is continuing to 74, in February 1974, way up deep in the mountains of Fayette County, not far along the ridge, as I was talking about before, where a lot of weird things go on, a woman living in her cabin deep in the mountains heard a commotion on her little cabin porch. She thought it was some wild dogs been coming through. She decided she was going to scare the dogs off with her shotgun. She loaded one chamber of her shotgun. She turned on the porch light. She opened the door, walked out on the porch, but there's no dogs. But just right directly in front of her, 2-3 feet away, there's this huge hairy creature with his arms straight up over its head. And what does she do? She fires right into it with her shotgun. She said there was this bright flash of light like a strobe on a camera, and it disappears right in front of her. And that's only part of the story.
Wow.
So if that case and other cases that we came up with, and I'm aware of other similar cases from around the country and around the world, but these are the really intriguing cases that many people never heard about before, this suggests we're dealing with something which may indicate that at least some of these incidents suggest that these things may not be normal flesh and blood animals. I'm looking more into something, for a better term, that appear to be interdimensional, that under certain conditions and maybe certain geographical locations, there are certain elements there that under certain conditions, these entities come into our physical reality, they leave physical evidence, they appear to be solid most of the time, and they just suddenly disappear and they're gone. Where do they come from and where do they go? And my next book, by the way, which hopefully will be out in the next couple of months, is going to have many very, very strange creature encounters like this in it.
Which brings me to another of my questions. We've got about 4 minutes before our break. Do you believe that there are certain zones, certain places where this type of stuff is exceptionally common? And have you noticed any kind of patterns with that? Is there a pattern to time? Run with that one.
Hello?
Yes, Stan, are you there?
Oh, okay, I thought you cut off there in the end. I'm sorry.
Uh-oh. Yes, I'm curious about, and I'm sure we can edit that out, but I'm curious about the connection between places and sightings. Do you notice that there are some small areas that are, I'm sure you do, that are highly concentrated for exceptional human experience, these sightings? Have you ever noticed a pattern of time involved in that? I mean, do they go in cycles that are any predictability to them at all?
I've never seen any evidence of time, even though you probably have noticed this. A lot of very unusual events quite often occur around 3 to 3:30 in the morning. But in general, a lot of Bigfoot and UFO cases, they can occur any time of day or night in any type of weather conditions. But yes, again, as I mentioned, that area along the Chestnut Ridge is more than normally active with reports. But one of the main things I've noticed for years is that a lot of very close, low-level UFO sightings and a lot of very close encounters with Bigfoot, other cryptids such as the giant thunderbirds, Black Panther sightings, other strange entities, very commonly occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. So this is near power plants, high-tension power lines, gas wells, gas lines, radio transmission towers, railroad tracks, energy sources. And I've always thought for years and years there's a direct energy connection with a phenomena.
Well, oh boy, it sounds like our credits are coming in. Well, you've left the door wide open for some more brilliant questioning. We're going to take about a 5-minute break, and I can't wait to welcome our guest, Stan Gordon, back. So let's take 5.
You're listening to Go Podcast Yourself Network.
Let's go check it out
at gopodcastyourself.com. And we love you.
again. This is Mason Winfield, the host of Twilight on the Western Door. After our break, our discussion about the UFO Bigfoot connection with the fascinating and erudite Stan Gordon. Stan, are you here?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Stan, we finished our first half hour without me getting a chance to ask you a question I wanted to. You see, I'm pretty much of a pattern guy. I'm always looking for patterns. Sometimes you can't find them, but it's good to just take a look. And what I'm curious about is, see, the reason I ask this is that some of the communities I research, they really heat up for ghost stories at certain times of year. For instance, here in East Aurora, the town we're in right now, late June and late December, they tend to really heat up for ghost stories. And that's the summer solstice and the winter solstice. Other communities don't do that. Have you ever noticed any pattern at all with the sightings of the UFOs, the Bigfoot connection? Have you noticed a connection to maybe solstices, to equinoxes, to various times of the year, calendar dates? You ever noticed any pattern like that?
Well, again, reports come in all year round. We always get a lot more reports, but this is normal when the weather gets better. When the weather breaks after wintertime through the spring and summer months, we get more reports from more people outside. What I did notice during that big wave of Bigfoot sightings back in '73, it seemed as though there quite often was a lot of activity, sometimes on really hot, humid nights, foggy nights, and sometimes when there was a full moon. But in the years since then, I've really not noticed that to be the case.
Okay, had to ask. Have you noticed any connections between Bigfoot or the UFO material you've got? Have you noticed any connection between it and the Native Americans, either legends of the Native Americans or places that they consider to be power places?
Oh yeah, I mean there's a lot of history, of course, with Native American information here in Pennsylvania, burial grounds and petroglyphs, especially up in Fayette County, one of the hot areas for all these phenomena. And yes, over the years, some local areas where there has been, we know that there was information concerning the local Native Americans had been uncovered. There was quite a bit of Bigfoot sightings and other strange animal accounts and some UFO sightings quite often pretty close by where some of those type of, mounds were or burial grounds reportedly were in the area. So we came across this at different times. Now, that's not something that shows up, frequently, but in past years that has turned up. And yes, there's a lot of history of Native Americans from all parts of the state where some have history about encountering Bigfoot-type creatures, and even talking about strange water creatures in Pennsylvania. And, there, of course, the Thunderbird reports of their giant bird sightings are, quite common here in Pennsylvania and around the country. So, yeah, the Native Americans apparently have been aware of some of these things for many, many years.
Yeah, my Algonquin friend Michael Bastine, he co-authored a book with me, and he's pretty much my first sounding board among the Native Americans. He doesn't believe, well, first of all, he does agree, or he does inform me that the Native Americans have traditionally had a lot of traditions about the Bigfoot, and Michael himself doesn't believe it's a physical, biological creature. He certainly sort of agrees with you that it might be interdimensional. Because that's one of the only things that explains it. I mean, so many people say they see it, and there is occasionally physical evidence found, but it doesn't seem like there's any place for the thing to hide, and where does it go? And it vanishes. And so, I'd say that's probably a lowest common denominator theory for the apparent facts we're presented. I want to ask you a question about yourself, unless I cut you off. Did I cut you off?
No, go. I was just going to say that, the Native Americans, a lot of the tribes around the country have always felt that Bigfoot was more spiritual in nature than being a physical animal of the forest. And it may well be that they've been right on track because, again, a lot of the data that I've seen over the years now suggests, again, that in a lot of cases, we may be dealing with something other than a flesh and blood animal, strange as it sounds. But that's the only thing that makes any sense, that something that comes into our reality under certain conditions, leaves physical evidence, appears physically solid, and then it's gone. Where do they come from? Where do they go?
Well, that as a guy who probably puts most of his energy these days into researching supernatural folklore concerning ghosts, I'm not at all stunned by the idea that people see things or say they see things, and then those things cannot be found. I wanted to ask you another question about yourself. Would you say that your prime claim to prominence as a ufologist is the connection to Bigfoot? Are you pretty much the guy that broke this?
Oh, I probably have been more outgoing and talking about this, especially in the last few years since I wrote my book, and especially the fact that I uncovered some of probably the best documented cases of UFOs and Bigfoot seen together, and coming away saying, I don't know what association the two have, but because it's so strange, I'm not going to ignore it and put it on the carpet and pretend it didn't exist. I'm putting this information out there for the country, for people in the UFO and Bigfoot community, for the public, to try to learn from it, try to get more people and encourage them to share their information on it to try to find more about it. I was probably at least one of the earliest people that began to find this out. Probably one of the few that's really been outspoken, about it, because I'm very much convinced that, what we came up over the years is pretty solid information. And again, don't have the evidence. We don't know what it means, but I'm not going to ignore it because it's so strange.
Sure. I have to ask you this. You did mention other cryptids. Have you found yourself any? I mean, the general public doesn't realize how common big snake reports are, like big lizards, watery beings. I mean, the Loch Ness Monster is only the most famous example, but actually, I'm more of a specialist in New York State, and there are probably 100 inland bodies of water in New York State that have a rumor among the Native Americans about some kind of a giant lizard-like watery monster, like a dragon or a big snake or something. It's actually a very likely image for the human mind to project, to think they see. But have you found a connection to UFOs and sightings of this type of cryptid, the big snake?
I can't say connection. I can tell you. In fact, my next book, which again we mentioned is all on creatures, is going to have a chapter on water creatures, which I've never really talked much about before. And there are areas, in the Pittsburgh area, especially back in the early 70s when I was doing a lot of talk radio, a lot of people were calling in and telling me about their experience of seeing this very large serpentine-like creature in the rivers around Pittsburgh.
No
and,
way.
Of course, Kinzua Dam the history of that goes back to, the early 1970s, where they have a very large creature in there, and they nicknamed it the Kinzua Dragon.
Enormous supernatural folklore about the Kinzua.
Very heavy with reports of UFO sightings, Bigfoot encounters, and the paranormal going on all around that general area. So, who's to say?
Yeah. You've never heard of a big snake report at the same time as a UFO report, in other words, or have you?
Not a report of a big snake, but we had a very strange report, and I don't have that in front of me right at the moment, but it was a very interesting, and this happened just in the last few years, in an area that, probably a more populated area, actually, but early morning hours, of a low-level UFO sighting that was hovering outside of a fellow's apartment building, illuminating the inside of his apartment, and he got a really good look at this thing, and he got a few seconds of video of this thing as it's taking off. But the next day, when he went outside and was looking around the area where the thing was hovering, he saw this very large, very strange creature that he had no idea what it was trying to crawl through, actually like some cement and rocks where they were doing some construction. And it wasn't really snake-like, but it was more... and I'm trying to think. It's like I said, it's been a while since I looked this up, and I have to see if I can find it, but it was very, very interesting and something very, very odd. And it was, I just can't think offhand exactly what I wanted to call it, but it was a small, slithering type thing, but you really wouldn't call it a snake.
Sure. You know, I've interviewed very credible witnesses who've seen something serpentine in the Kinzua Dam area. Well, we're actually doing very well on time. We've got plenty of time to get to what I call the Twilight Top 10 Challenge. I am going to mention for you, Stan, 10 topics that I'm kind of curious about, and I'd like you to react to them as briefly or as fully as you would like, and just tell me whether you believe they're valid. What do you think about them? I'm going to start with the Men in Black. Have you ever met anyone who said they've seen the Men in Black? Do you believe in it?
Well, yes, I'm very much aware of the reports. In fact, going back as late as or early as the 1965 with the UFO crash case, we had mystery men in dark suits who were apparently on the scene with military personnel down in the woods where the UFO had crashed in Pennsylvania. So that's my earliest experience with Men in Black. Later on, in years gone by, I've had incidents in Pennsylvania dealing with UFOs and even some with Bigfoot, which indicated that the government was interested in some of the cases I had investigated. And in some of those events, very strange things did occur, including the famous 1973 multiple witness UFO landing where you had a large object on the ground in a field and two Bigfoot creatures in the field at the same time, and this huge glowing object on the ground or right above it, illuminating the whole area. And when this man took a shot at it, at the creatures, one of the one creature raised its right hand to reach out to grab what the guy fired at that point was just he fired two shots. They were tracers, and the one tracer, when I went to grab that tracer, the creature screamed, and the object, this huge object in the field, just suddenly vanished and disappeared. And interestingly, when the state trooper came to investigate it a short time later, that area where the object was on the ground was self-luminescent and glowing, about 100 to 150 feet in diameter. And then, years later, during a follow-up investigation, we found out from the key witness, because he always thought that these guys were part of my group, because we had spent a lot of time up there with repeat investigations. That was one of the strangest cases ever on record. And he thought that these two people were part of my group. Well, we found out that because years and years later we considered possibly hypnosis, which we never did at the time, because a famous psychiatrist who was working on a case with us suggested we didn't at that point. On a follow-up, when we asked him about it, he says to us, "Why do you want to hypnotize me again?" And my associate and I looked at each other like, "What are you talking about?" And he tells us about these two men that came to his home to do a follow-up investigation on his incident of seeing the UFO on the ground in the Big Feet. One was in an Air Force office, one was in an Air Force uniform, one was in a black suit. One had a briefcase. And in that briefcase, they had many photos of UFOs and Bigfoot. And they wanted him to point out what was similar to what he saw. And these guys apparently did hypnotize him, and they said they would be in touch, but he never heard from them again. And, of course, we never were able to find out who these fellows were. That's just an example of some of the incidents that I've dealt with.
Well, I take that answer in the affirmative.
That's correct.
Have you heard of something called the Great Lakes Triangle, and do you believe in it as a UFO zone?
Well, I hear a lot of these stories, and I'm familiar with a lot of these events that have gone on for years, but I deal mainly in Pennsylvania. And if I can't get directly involved in a case, it's really hard for me to say something positively yes or no. I mean, from what I've read, there seems to be something to it, but I also found over the years many, many prominent cases that came across as being a real event. Years later, we determined it may have been something else. So I'm always a little cautious, but it seems like there may be something to some of those accounts.
Sure. How about the black helicopters associated with Men in Black, the cover-up. Do you believe? Have you heard about those in your area? Do you believe in them?
Oh, yeah. We've had reports of helicopters, military helicopters, as recent weeks, actually, here in Pennsylvania, with some of the activity that's going on. Actually, and up in Fayette County, which we mentioned before, and I've lost track when this was, but this is probably in the last couple of months. There was apparently one of those unexplained mystery booms that shook the area, and some of my other informants and myself were getting information that after that happened, supposedly strange lights were seen, and then soon after there was an abundance of helicopters and military helicopters in the area. And I've heard other reports in recent weeks of black helicopters being seen across the state. But, once again, I also have to look at this as, the fact that, yes, some of these reports are a little strange, but I also know that there's a lot of military activity in the skies of Pennsylvania every day. And there are military helicopters that do, cross our airspace every day on various missions. So there may well be explanations for some of these incidents.
Got you. Do you have any reaction? And you, I think, like myself, are very regionally focused, as I'm gathering. I mean, my study pretty much is upstate New York, and am I correct in suggesting that you're pretty regional to your part of Pennsylvania? Yeah. Okay. Cool. But undoubtedly, you come across the broader subject, and you're way better positioned to talk about it than I. So if I ask you what you think about Area 51, how do you react to that? What do you think?
Well, I mean, we know a lot about Area 51, and a lot of the mystery really isn't a mystery. It's been out there for years and years. I mean, that was definitely one of the areas where there was a lot of advanced aircraft testing. There was a lot of re-engineering, for example, I believe, of Soviet MiGs that we recovered. And it's a place where very possibly, other materials were recovered and studied. And, of course, we've heard for years, which we can't confirm, but some people who seem to have some interesting knowledge suggest that some type of ET craft or even bodies were taken to that base and examined. But, closer to home, I think it's much more likely that probably a lot of the really good history of recoveries of UFOs and entities was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Fairborn, Ohio. I mean, there's pretty much no doubt that some of the Roswell material went to Wright-Patterson. We know that the object here that I worked on for years, the Kexper case, that object that fell December 9th of 65, late that afternoon, but during the early morning hours of December 10th, around 1 o'clock in the morning, a large military flatbed tractor trailer carrying a large tarped object was seen by many, many people around here, and I later was told from good sources that it first went to Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio, stayed there under very high security for a short time, then continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And other informants told me later from that base that exactly what building they took it to. Now, where it's still at today, we don't know. But numerous other investigators, such as the late Len Stringfield, who is the main person who kind of coined the UFO crash retrievals. He worked a lot on crash cases, and he and I were very, very close. And he had a lot of information from personnel who used to work at Wright-Patterson about the recovery of spacecraft and also the reports of bodies being seen at the base. And so I'd say there's a lot of really good information concerning Wright-Patterson out there.
Tell me about this, the concept of underwater bases for UFOs. Do you think there's any likelihood or possibility at all that they may be having secret bases under the Great Lakes or under our bodies of water?
Well, that's a possibility. I said years ago that when you eliminate all of the cases you can explain with UFOs and Bigfoot and the paranormal, a lot of sightings that I've investigated over the years initially seemed strange. When you investigate, many had either a natural or a man-made explanation. So then you got that percentage of sightings you could not dismiss so easily. And I felt for years that there's more than one origin for the unknown category of these UFO reports. So maybe we're dealing with Some may be extraterrestrial. Maybe some are, who knows, they're interdimensional time travelers. Maybe some type of unknown natural phenomena. We may be dealing with different things. But there's been a long history of these things coming in and out of the waterways around the country and around the world, including here in Pennsylvania. You know, there have been numerous reports of these things hovering over the rivers and lakes, and even times going in, you know, to the rivers and lakes. I remember one case we had years ago of an object hovering over a river and sucking a huge amount of water out of the river up into the craft. And just many, many strange sightings around the waterways. And of course, the Navy, you know, a lot of people would know, but the Navy was probably deeper involved in UFO research back in the early days than the Air Force was. And the Navy always had a lot of reports of these things hovering near their ships and going in and out of the oceans. So they've had an interest for years. So, yes, I'd say that there's something going on under the water. Now, whether we're really establishing bases, of course, unless we find one, we really can't be sure.
Sure. Well, until very recently, the deep ocean would have been a great place to hide. You know, we just didn't have the technology.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. Here's the 800-pound gorilla here. A la the X-Files TV programs, do you think there's any likelihood of a government or even an occult conspiracy to either cover up evidence or to even contact and work with extraterrestrials? You ever come across anything that made you think that that could be viable?
Well, you know, you hear the stories out there that the government had a liaison with various type of ETs from different parts of the country, and they're working together on underground bases. But again, while some of the stories are very intriguing, it's basically hearsay. But I can tell you, like I said, over the years, I've had incidents here in Pennsylvania which strongly suggest that the government has an interest in both UFOs and Bigfoot. No. And my personal opinion is that the government has never got out of the UFO investigation field. I mean, they publicly dropped Project Blue Book. It actually physically closed down in January 1970. Over the years, myself and other investigators using the Freedom of Information Act have obtained numerous government UFO documents which indicate that certain agencies were continuing to follow up on the UFO investigations many years after they told the public they were out of it. And I firmly believe that they're still at a very high level investigating these incidents. My feeling is that the government knows a lot about these subjects, but probably doesn't have all the answers themselves. That whatever we're dealing with, the UFO phenomenon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's ongoing. There's nothing they can do about it. They're not in control, which is likely the reason why they're not telling the public much about it, because they just don't have all the answers themselves.
Sure. They figure it might be a little too much for us to handle.
It may well be.
What do you make of the abduction experiences? Have you met any individuals that thought they'd been abducted by a UFO, and did you believe it?
Well, I was probably one of the first investigators in the country that really got deeply involved in the abduction cases back in the 60s when things were just beginning to break. So I was in a lot longer than a lot of the well-known names in the field, but that wasn't my primary focus because we were dealing with so many cases all the time, including numerous abduction cases. What people don't realize is some of these abduction cases were extremely detailed and involved. I mean, you could spend weeks and months and years really just working on one abduction case because sometimes they involved multiple family members, and some of these were ongoing events. So I can just tell you that some of the people I recall talking with, I mean, a lot of them were credible. I mean, they were school teachers, police officers. I remember one guy was a minister. I mean, and these were people that something was happening to them that was affecting their lives. You know, I can't say that, yes, they're being abducted by aliens, but something very unusual was happening with some of these people. And again, some of these people who had events 20, 30 years ago, I'm still in touch with today. And some of these people still are having ongoing events, and other members of their family, other generations of their family are having experiences. But something was going on. One case I always found very intriguing. I had some of my investigators working on it. It was a distance from where I'm at back in the 60s. From what I recall, this was an incident where this man, during the late night, early morning hours, would leave his home, walk out in the woods, and reportedly would go aboard this object that was landed, and various biological experiments experiments were taking place. And one thing I remembered him saying that always stuck with me, this was long before anybody talked about the grays or what they really look like in detail. And he said to us, he said, these things look like Pillsbury Doughboys.
Hey, we're down to about 1 minute by my count. We about right, Scott? Oh, we got 5. Oh, fantastic. We'll get our work done today. I did want to ask you, the UFO, I hate to call it a mythology, but really I guess that's what it is when it's a developed system that isn't proven. Today's pop UFO mythology features lots of different personalities among the aliens, Nordics, Greys, reptilians. In your opinion, is there anything to that?
I hear, again, a lot of these stories, and over the years, especially back in the 60s, that was a time when there were a lot of reports of landing cases, reports of small humanoid creatures, or sometimes very human-like creatures seen near landed craft. So a lot of the entities that I've dealt with over the years with different witnesses, most of them were very humanoid looking. Sometimes they were dressed a little different, but some of them could have probably passed us on the street and you wouldn't know the difference. And then, of course, we've had some even stranger reports over the years of some of these different entities as well. But, people talk about the reptilian reports, and extremely rare did we ever hear those kind of stories. Most of the reports we dealt with were generally smaller humanoid-type creatures.
Well, they did say that God made humanity, or in his or her image. So I guess if the other intelligent life forms have got 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, it's probably not that much of a knockout. I want to ask you the 10th of my questions in our top 10 challenge. Actually, no, I got 2 left. I wanted to ask you, because I crossed one out and I put another one in. Do you see any connection in ancient rock art? Anything there that makes you say, aha, we've got a Bigfoot, aha, we've got an E.T.?
I've heard of some things, especially out in the West, that might, and like I said, petroglyphs, some of the Indian drawings, Native American drawings might show something, but I've not personally seen them, so I really can't make any judgment on that.
Sure. Okay, got you. Because, back, I remember in the day, the 80s, Eric von Daniken, one of his specialties was taking a look at ancient rock carvings and analyzing them and saying, aha, this proves we've got a ET or a UFO here. And the trick is, very often these images he was analyzing, you don't need UFOs to explain them. In other words, the anthropologists, the archaeologists have a very good understanding of what those images probably meant. So there's a danger in an untrained person kind of approaching ancient work. I did want to ask you something else you may have come across. What do you make, and this will be our last question of the day, what do you make of chemtrails?
Well, that's not an area that I've really gone into, and I've talked to a lot of people, who see them in Pennsylvania, who are very much convinced that the government or somebody is, dropping some kind of materials. I've talked to pilots over the years who have seen them, and they told me they believe that there's nothing abnormal, and some of these guys have been flying for years and years, and I've known some of these guys, and they have said they've looked into it, and they've never seen anything that really was unusual. Because I know with the weather, and I'm pretty familiar with meteorological conditions and all, that under certain conditions, you can have some very odd things develop in the sky, especially when you have multiple jet traffic going on. And so I keep an open mind to it, but it's not an area that I've really, really focused on.
We appreciate your insights and your candor. We've got about a minute to go, Stan, and I don't have anything more to ask you. You've been a magnificent subject for an interview. Anything you'd like to say to lead us to your website or promote any of your work or summarize the subject?
Yeah, well, people want to go to my website. It's, of course, www.stangordon.info. They can go there for upcoming events, lectures I'll be doing, upcoming sightings that are going on. So it's always updated. And my two books, Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook, which has some amazing, weird cases in it. You can get that on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or through my website. My other book is Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, which has a lot of cases where people are physically close to, like, UFOs, Bigfoot, strange creatures. And my next book should be out hopefully in the next couple of months, called Encounters with Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures. And they can also reach me by way of email through my website, or at paufo@comcast.net.
That's fantastic. Well, I hear our very mysterious and entrancing closing credits fading in, for which we thank the Afro-Celt Sound System, a Scottish African fusion band that we admire so much. Their music sounds like what we mean, mood merging and mysticism. We thank them for their work as we thank Chris Starr, Carolyn Smith, and the whole GPY, that is Go Podcast Yourself Network. Most of all today, we thank our highly informed and professional guest, Stan Gordon. If you missed Stan's contact information, you can contact him for speaking events through our website and through our Facebook page, Twilight on the Western Door. Otherwise, until we meet again, shine in that light whose smile kindles the universe. Work every day to make this a better world. We'll see you next time.
All right. What part of PA are you from?
I'm about 30 miles east of Pittsburgh.
Straight east or northeast?
Pretty much southeast.
All right. Let's see here. East. An hour. We're talking Blairsville area?
Not far. Blairsville, New Alec, Derry, Latrobe, Greensburg.
Gotcha. Yep. I'm actually from Homer City.
The Blairsville Witch Project.
I know Homer City very well.
Yeah, I was born and raised down there.
There's been a lot of history of a lot of weird stuff up around Homer City, especially since when they were building the power station. Ever since, there's been many UFO sightings and other incidents right around there, and continues to be.
Oh, yeah. Actually, where my parents' house is literally, you could actually look out their front of their house, and you can see the power plant. Like, they can see it on top of the hillside.
Yeah. Well, they're actually living in one of the most active areas probably in the country, not far from the Chestnut Ridge.
Yep.
Which we'll probably talk about, which has year after year phenomena going on up there.